Hey, this is Guy from New Plastic, and today we have our first tutorial selected by our patrons. We're going to make fully procedural, realistic wood patterns. Literally no image will be used to get these looks. I made a bunch of different fully procedural wood materials like rosewood, oak, pine, birch, cedar, walnut, cocobolo, snake wood, and a bunch more polished, dirty, whatever you want. Check out the pack on my Gumroad if you feel like you need it. Link is in the description. Another way to support the channel is through Patreon, where you can get the tutorial project files, my own personal project files, early access, free products, and a bunch of other stuff. But most importantly, help me focus on making better and more content. A warm and cuddly hug goes out to all my monumental patrons and members: Elad, Spencer Clark, Abhishek Singh, Lynn, KV Davey, Yining Gong, Guillaume Lopez, The Great Wanderer Studios, Harley Spick, Enangwa Saroni, Dave Toro, Neil Pollack, Builder Bull, Quarantine Pajot, Kiki Lem, Sophia Wilton, MS, Emmanuel Ornelas, Bass Pixels, Shauna Kiyama, Teho Lai, Super, Leandra Luna, Suki Violet Sue, Jonah, Manson, 3D Monkey Biz, Kaylor, Jake, She Was Lost, Pierre Marie Burton, Chris Schultz, Braganay, Mariano Carnavale, Bob, Molworks Limited, Arlen, Elijah Jackson, Maximilian Keslow, John Cedar, Stav Sabolev, Batolot, Ingimar Wolferson, Ozan Sahin, Brendan Blair, Ryan, Junzi Zhao, Mohammed, and everybody else on the list. I can't thank you enough, really. Follow me on Instagram at Ojang, subscribe, share, comment, go out for a hike, get some fresh air, get those muscles going. Let's go. Okay, so I'm going to start with a cube so you can see all sides of the effect and how kind of the effect works in three-dimensional space. And you can see how on a real wood plank, the ring pattern looks different on each side. They're basically different cross-sections of the same rings. We'll get into it a little bit in a second. I'm going to start by adding a universal material, change the BRDF mode to Backman or GGX, whatever works for you. Let me turn off all these extra stuff just to declutter the whole thing. And let's put it on, and I'm going to turn on metallic and then bring it all the way down and then turn it off. Okay, so this whole procedural wood thing is based on this OSL you can find here in MA, which is MAWoodGrain. And if we plug it into the albedo, you can start to see what it does, but we're going to get into it. This is a really cool OSL code that has all these wood attributes. It's written by Michel Adres, so shout out to him. He wrote it in 2012, which is crazy. He also kind of tried to help me out figuring it out via email, so shout out to him. All right, so we have all these features here that make up a wood pattern. Another way to get this OSL is to add like a OSL texture, and then from this list choose MAWoodGrain. It's practically the same. There's one difference though, and yeah, as you can see, it's all the same features. The only difference is that this OSL from the MA list is kind of pre-limited. So all these features are limited to a pretty low number. While here, you can go all the way up to like kind of an infinite number. Now, that's cool, but it can be too much. Like, it's hard to dial in like details when there's no limit to the numbers. And if you go to the code, you can see that if you go to this MA list code, you can see that they're all limited inside the code. So there's a minimum and maximum float number. What I like to do is I like to go to this limited code and just edit the minimum slightly larger than it is. So now I can move in within a reasonable range and dial in settings and still have a variety, but not have like unlimited variety that really makes it harder to dial in details. Okay, so here's another tricky thing. If I move the model, you can see that the rings are floating. They're kind of stuck to world space. Now, I guess in other render engines, you can just assign the space to each OSL texture, but here you can't in this specific OSL node. So the way to attach this to the object's UV or the object space is to find this line right here, the point vector in line 144. And really all you have to do is edit from point vector equals P to point vector equals transform, parenthesis, quotes, object, quotes, comma, P, and then end parenthesis. So now if I compile this, now the rings are stuck to the object space and I can move it around and you can see that the rings move with it. You know, if you're not planning on moving your object, it doesn't matter, but if you are, that's pretty important. So that's kind of just a small thing that I figured out by myself. And I was pretty proud, but you know, I'm ignorant when it comes to OSL, so that was a big thing for me. All right, now that we got all this figured out, let's reset. Actually, let's bring it all to the default settings, and now we can start editing everything. Before we start going over the details, let me turn off grain. And also, you can see we have these 2 nodes that we can attach the color to. Right now, it's this default kind of wood, generic wood color, but I like to just have it black and white. So I'm going to attach a float to the light wood and another float to the dark wood. And that will be white on the light one and black on the dark one. Now, sharpness obviously makes the rings sharper. So the higher it is, the more defined the rings are. Ringy kind of does the same thing. So the higher the ringy is, the more black the rings are. Ring frequency just adds more rings, basically. So let me edit the frequency minimum and maximum. So we have like more maximum and also the ringy. Yeah, okay, so now we have more to work with. So now if I bring up the frequency, you can see it just adds more rings. The unevenness basically just adds more variety in the ring's width. So if I up it by a lot, then you can see that there's more variety in the ring's width. And as you add more variety, you also increase the amount of rings, as you can see. So you got thin ones and thick ones. That's pretty cool. The next one is ring noise. Now this will add a distortion to the overall rings, to all of the rings together. The ring noise is the amount of distortion, and the noise frequency is the scale of the noise. So if I up the frequency, and let's also edit that one to have more than one. So now if I up the frequency, you can see that the noise becomes really small and you get this tiny kind of scale to the noise. And this depends on the look you're going for. Usually I keep the noise strength very low and then either go for low frequencies to affect and distort the overall ring structure, or go for high frequencies if I want to keep the overall ring structure but just break it up a little bit on a micro level. Grain essentially adds some sort of like tiny specks, like a grain type thing. Now you can't, I'm trying to up it now, but you can't see it. And if I edit it, you can't see it, and that's because of the sharpness. So if I bring down the sharpness a little bit, you can start to see the grain. So let's set the sharpness like 0.5. And now I can play with the grain, and that adds like this tiny, subtle or not subtle, kind of uniform noise to it all that kind of mimics grain. And it's really cool because if I zoom in, you can see that the one side has this more uniform noise, and on the other sides, the noise is kind of stretched because wood has what's called the end grain side and the face or edge grain side. Usually the end grain is more uniform and stipply, and the face grain is more stretched and linear, but it depends on the wood type. And let's edit the code to add more range to the grain frequency, and now I can really up the frequency by a lot, which will make the grain way smaller. So like the rest, grainy refers to the strength of the grain noise, and frequency refers to the scale of the noise. And again, the scale kind of depends on the wood you're going for. Now, trunk wobble and angular wobble refer to the distortion and formation of the rings on either the end grain or the face and edge grain. Let's bring both to 0 so we can see what each one does. So trunk wobble essentially refers to the distortion on the face and edge side. If I set the trunk frequency to 1 and start slowly raising the trunk wobble, you can see that the face and edge sides are starting to wobble and distort, but the end grain doesn't distort. It just moves around because its position is relative to the other sides. And if I crank up the trunk frequency, you can see how all the sides are getting more and more dense, and yet the end side doesn't distort while the other sides distort. Also, you'll notice that the trunk wobble mainly condenses the rings on the z-axis, meaning horizontally. Okay, let's set them as 0 and play with the angular wobble, and you will immediately notice that now the ring shapes on the end side are starting to distort, and if I up the angular frequency, the distorting scale is getting smaller. And if I increase the frequency limits and keep cranking it up, you'll see how as the distortion scale gets smaller, we get more and more central circular rings. And you'll notice that the face and edge grain are getting more and more condensed on the y-axis, meaning vertically. So one thing to remember is that as we increase the wobble frequency, we get a lot more rings. So we can always go back and bring down the ring frequency at the top of the attributes. And now I can play with the scale of the frequencies. If you're dealing with a really small piece of wood, you want the frequency to be smaller. And if you're dealing with a large piece of wood, there's going to be more rings, right? So you want to scale up your frequencies. So that also, it depends on which type of wood you're trying to make, the density of the rings, but also what's the scale of the piece of wood you're working with. Because the bigger the scale is, the more rings you're going to get. And now it's really about, kind of playing with the strength of the wobbleness and the frequencies to get the look that you want. So for example, I can also mix it with the general ring noise to get more subtle distortions overall. And this is what it comes down to. Every detail depends on other details. So once you figure one part out, you dial in another part and then you go back and change another part. You can really get very detailed and a huge variety of results. So I'm playing with the unevenness and, I'm getting thicker and thinner rings. And, I'm looking at the center of each ring when I shift settings around. And of course, I'm looking at the overall distortion of the rings and just how it looks. So let's say you figured out a certain look. Now it's all about getting more and more and more details, because really, to me, to sell the look as realistic as possible, it's all about getting as much subtle detail as you can. This OSL allows you to get a lot of subtle details, but you can push it even more. So for example, we can put aside those float nodes and use a noise node instead. So now if I plug in this noise node to the light wood, now you can see that the light wood has this inherent noise in it. And let's kind of play with it, that's kind of up to you, and make it really bright, because this is the light wood. Maybe up the contrast, scale it up a little bit, up the details. And now I can put an invert node and plug that into the dark wood. And if I make it very light, the invert will become darker. And it's not enough. Let's actually use an Octane gradient. And now I can invert the knots. And now I can really get like a dark version of the same noise. So now I have a dark version of that noise for the dark wood and a light version of that noise for the light wood. And it just adds more subtle details to the colors. So let's color this whole thing. We can add a gradient node to the OSL and give it some kind of a color, so maybe a dark. And actually, let's find a reference image. So I have all these kind of reference images here, and I'm using Pure Ref app. I'm just dragging it into the app. So now this is right here, and now I can color pick the colors from the Pure Ref app, which is really useful. So I pick the color of the light rings and the dark rings, and I can edit it to kind of make it look a bit better. And it's kind of working, right? I mean, you can start to see how we're starting to get some kind of a wood pattern, but there's not enough detail here. A better way to do it, in my opinion, is to add a mix node and then add another noise, and then use the OSL wood as the amount. This noise is texture 1, plug it through a gradient node, and then add another gradient node, plug the same noise to that, and then plug that to texture 2. And now the dark parts of the Wood OSL will show texture 1, and the light parts of the Wood OSL will show texture 2. And now I can copy the color from that gradient and paste it into our dark gradient and just make the whole thing darker, and then paste it into the light gradient and make the whole thing lighter. And now we got a noise pattern that's colorized in a darker version and a lighter version. And now you can start to see that we get more variation in color in each ring. The darker rings and the lighter rings get this unevenness. And it's still like a dark ring and a light ring, but there's more variety to it. And if I solo the color, you can really start to see how it looks. I can also stretch the noise, and that gives it even a nicer look. And now you can play with the gradients and with the noise gamma and contrast to get a more noisy pattern or a less noisy pattern, a darker or a lighter version. But yeah, now we're actually starting to get somewhere a bit more realistic than like solid colors. So again, it's all about adding more subtle details to the already detailed OSL. Now let's plug this whole thing to the bump node. And now you can see that everything dark is bumped down, everything light is bumped up, which is pretty cool. It's a bit too harsh for me. So one way is to plug it through a multiply node and attach a float node to the texture 2. And now you can play with the float node, and you can bring it down to get less of the bump effect and bring it up to get more of the bump effect. Now, usually the dark parts of the wood are less shiny. Not always, but most of the times. We can do that by plugging a gradient node to the specular and then passing the whole bump system through the gradient node. Now, if we solo that, we can invert the nodes and really crush the contrast. And if we look, it's not working. What if we plug the noise to the system? And actually, I have to invert it. So yeah, so now all the dark parts are actually dark. So there's less specular there, right? And now you can see we have less specular in the dark parts. And let's up the IOR. There's no one IOR to wood. It's really up to you and how you want it to look artistically. And we can also add a color correction node to the whole color system. So now I can really dial in the whole color system. Add more contrast, add more gamma, make it darker, brighter, more saturated, less saturated. And now I can go back to our noise textures, you know, edit them, edit the bump, edit the Wood OSL, you know, get more rings, less rings, more distortions, less distortions, dialing down the graininess. And I'm playing with the colors. And now it's really about just like getting the look that you want. To me, the color is really important. Once I got all the details done, getting like a realistic color scheme is important. That's why I'm kind of adding this color correction where I can really dial in the details of the colors. Now, let's say you're kind of satisfied with how it looks. Now I can add another noise, combine that with our bump system with a multiply node, plug that into the bump. And now I can use this noise to add just overall scratches, dents, and stuff like that. So let's change the type to chips, invert it, up the contrast, up the gamma, and actually need to uninvert it, and I reduce the gamma. Yeah, so now we get these tiny black cracks. And, you know, I can play with the gamma and the contrast, and you can start to see these kind of sporadic dents that are kind of scattered around, you know, maybe pull down the omega. Yeah, so you can kind of start to see it. It's really hard to see it, and I think that's because of the fact that the bump system that it's multiplied with is really dark, so it's kind of dark on dark. So if we make the bump system brighter, the ring bumps, the wood bump, you'll see it more. Also, let's plug a texture projection to all of our noises and change it to XYZ to UVW, and now you can really start to see it more. Yeah, now you can really start to see all those dents. So, man, that is pretty incredible if you ask me. I mean, once you add all these details and, you know, you can really dial in the settings of the wood that you're going for, you can get some incredible results. So let's see how this looks on an actual sculpture object that we have. Now we can already see that our rings, to me, are pretty big, you know, especially on the face. So I'm going to up the frequency and I'm going to bring down the unevenness and again, up the frequency even more. So the more I up the frequency, the more rings we have and the smaller they have to be, right? So yeah, you see I'm cranking up the ring frequency, so I'm getting more thinner rings. And I'm kind of going for that oak sculpture I have in my reference. It's more of like a light general reference. I'm not trying to do anything identical to it. But yeah, just kind of dialing in the colors, and you can start to see how the colors start to become more realistic, at least in my opinion. You know, maybe upping the frequency of the rings. That's pretty cool. You know, maybe up the saturation to get a bit more red out of it. And I can also, of course, add a color correction to the gradients to each kind of dark and light texture and dial that in as well. Let's say I'm satisfied with that. Now, just to get a little more detail out of it, I can add a dirt node, invert normal, and up the strength. And, you know, now you get all this black edges. So I'm going to bring down the spread. I'm going to kind of play with the radius until I get the kind of spread that I'm looking for, maybe up the details, and then plug it into an add node with a gradient node. I'm going to make the black like this very light wood color, cream color that we have here. I'm going to plug our whole color system to the add node as well. I'm going to actually change the white to black. And now you can see that all of our edges have this kind of lighter tone to them, which to me looks really good. It's like a worn out type effect, but it's very subtle. So I'm just playing with the noises and unsolo a noise and we crash, but we're back. Let's play with this kind of imperfection bump dents type noise. Just going to make it a bit smaller and lighter. That's pretty cool. And let's just check our specular channels. I think there's a lot of specular, a lot of rough specular, which is okay, but I want to add a little more sharp specular as well. So I'm going to actually add a coating layer. And that's pretty good. That's pretty good. I think we can add more detail to the coating layer. So maybe I'm going to rough it up a little bit, just a little bit, so it won't be so sharp. And I'm going to plug the bump node to the coding, not the coding bump, but the coding. And then I'm going to use a gradient node and let's solo this. And now I'm basically, wherever there's black, there's not going to be coating. And wherever there's white, there's going to be coating. And I'm just going to make the black like a very light gray and crank up the contrast and just kind of, you know, play with it. I don't want the coating layer to be spread evenly. Again, just more detail, more detail. So now the lighter parts have more coating layer and the darker parts have less. That looks pretty good. That looks fucking amazing, honestly. Like, this is procedural. You know what I mean? Isn't that crazy? I don't know. To me, it's crazy. Like, to me, the fact that this super detailed and realistic looking organic material comes from math, you know? Like, this is all math. This is all like algorithms. And it's super editable and, you know, non-repeatable, and the resolution is infinite. It's like, dude, this is so cool. Yeah, let's kind of move around. And I mean, you know, obviously you can kind of dial in the details a bit better and, you know, really take your time with it. But look at that. That looks like wood to me. You know, maybe it's a bit too shiny. Maybe I can play with the rings a bit more, but that is definitely an oaky looking sculpture. And of course, look, the more shiny it is, the more polished it is, right? So if you don't want it to be polished looking and sandpapered, then you don't need the coating layer and you really want the specular to be rough. But if you want it to be sandpapered and polished, you know, you want to bring down the bump and you want to add more sharp specular. All right, let's duplicate this material. And let's just kind of see what other types of wood we can get. So first of all, let me add a different reference. So let's add this reference, which is Rosewood. You can see it's significantly different. The rings are way smaller and way more noisy and grainy. And of course, the color scheme is way darker and more red. So right off the bat, I'm going to take the color correction node of the whole color scheme and just make it more this kind of walnutty, brownish red type look. It's a pretty unique color. Play with the saturation and hue and gamma until I get something pretty similar. This is a way more polished sculpture, so I'm going to bring down the bump, make it darker a little bit by upping the gamma, and already we're getting kind of close. Now let's play with the ring pattern. I want to add less grain to make it a bit cleaner, but also way more rings. So I'm going to up the frequency, the ring frequency, and I'm going to up the ring unevenness. I want to get all these different types of ring width and really make it like a noisy ring situation. Now let's add a bit more distortion to them. Let's bring down the scale. So now I get this subtle distortion on a very micro level, right? Because the frequency is way up and the strength is way down of the ring noise. And let's add more grain and let's actually add more rings. You can really see how the rings are like, they almost become like a noise pattern because they're so dense. And let's play with the angular frequency and wobble frequency. I don't want to get too many angular rings, like, you know, where the ring starts, where you see just a circle. I want to get more of these large strings. And we crash, but we're back. Let's play with this color noise. Just kind of play with the scale. And yeah, we're already looking pretty good. And how different is this from the last one, you know, which is, again, that's so cool that you can get all this variety of different looks and details. So I'm going to actually make it brighter by reducing the gamma of the overall color correction. And that looks closer to the reference. And also bring down the amount of bump by reducing the float on the bump multiply. And you can see the specular gets sharper and it gets more shiny, which is what I want. This sculpture is definitely more polished. And we can even plug a gradient node to the imperfection bumps noise and just bring down the black by a whole lot. We don't want too strong imperfections. And I can also play with the specific color gradients, maybe add a bit more contrast to the overall gradient of each dark and light noise color scheme. And yeah, just kind of dialing in details of the colors. Kind of went back in, let it render, and look at all this detail. I mean, look at all this subtle bump and, you know, ring detail. Man, this is really crazy to me. This is really beautiful. I went back and edited the coating and the specular. And I soloed the gradients, and you can see that the gradients don't have any detail in them. So I just kind of played with the gradients to get more of that ring detail. So again, like the dark spots have less coating layer on them. It's very subtle, but the name of the game is subtlety. Add more and more subtle details, and altogether they're going to make a big difference. All right, we can stop here with this. I mean, I think this is even better than the previous one. Let's duplicate this material, and let me show you a different method that doesn't use the OSL texture. A simpler way is to just add a Cinema 4D noise and plug that into our mix instead of the OSL texture. Let's change. Let's pick like a blistered turbulence. And let's solo this. And the key thing here is to up the cycles here. So I'm going to up it by a lot. And that's going to add all these rings. Right off the bat, you get where I'm going with this. Let's up the scale too. And let's up the octaves too to get more detailed rings. And you can up it more to get more detailed or less to get less details. What I'm also going to do is reduce the high clip almost to 0 to really choke the whites. So I get these really thin rings. And now you can see that we're getting these rings just by using a Cinema 4D noise. You don't have as much control. It doesn't look as realistic, but it's definitely like a quicker way to do this. Let's play with the color scheme. And now I can duplicate this noise, use a multiply node to combine both noises, plug that into the mix amount. And let's solo this. On the top noise, I can bring down the cycles. So now you see I have less rings that are multiplied on the last one. So I can up the high clip to make the rings wider, up the low clip to, choke the blacks more, make the black way lighter. So, we're kind of layering in different ring strength and width. And again, bring in another multiply node, duplicate this noise and mix that with the previous multiply. Plug that into the mix amount and do the same thing, maybe up the cycles on this one, maybe change the octaves, make it a bit lighter, maybe a bit actually darker. Yeah, just kind of play around, get different grayscale values, different contrasts, different cycles and different octaves, as long as you keep the same noise type and the same scale. And now you get these overlapping different types of rings. And, you can play with the color. And yeah, I mean, we got all the rest of the details already kind of dialed in, all the rest of the noises and the bump channel and all that. And we're just using a different system to get that ring pattern. Again, it's not as realistic at all. It's, it's almost not realistic. It still has the feel of wood, if you ask me. Especially if you get the right colors and the right kind of combinations of rings and scale of the rings. If you're familiar with the Cinema 4D noise, you might have an easier time with this. I think the OSL wood grain is much better because it does so many things just in one node, and it allows you to get so much more detail and so much more realistic detail out of this. But I just wanted to show you that it's also possible to get some kind of a procedural wood effect using the Cinema 4D noise. For the final render, I made the whole thing a bit darker and I upped the cycles on the thin rings, so I got way more rings. I might have changed the bump a little bit. And yeah, this is what I ended up with. I mean, dude, isn't that like crazy? Is it just me or is it crazy? I mean, I kind of, when I discovered this Wood OSL node months ago, I was like, this is kind of weird that there's a wood texture OSL node, which means it's a procedural wood thing. But I kind of started playing with it and I wasn't satisfied with the results. And I was like, yeah, dude, you can't get realistic wood out of like code. Can you? And the more I played with it, the more, realistic details and more control I got out of it, and the fact that you can get such an organic, familiar, because we all know how wood looks like, detailed, realistic look from basically math, right? From basically an algorithm. And the code. I mean, it's really exciting to me. That twilight zone between computer language and the realistic world was always one of the most fascinating aspects to me in 3D, and one of the reasons why I got into 3D. And this is sort of an epitome of that, getting realistic, highly realistic results and looks using code and math. To me is the epitome of the 3D world, or one of them. So yeah, I just super happy to share my excitement with you. And go check out the wood pack. There's a lot of cool textures there, kind of based it on realistic wood, but also kind of not. Yeah, if you feel like you need it, go cop it. My Gumroad, Patreon, YouTube members, all that. I love you. Have a great day. Peace.